Hello, I'm Mara Gold. I was the researcher on the Beyond the Binary exhibition, which we're looking at today, which is part of the Beyond the Binary project at the Pitt Rivers Museum. So I'll describe myself first. I have shoulder-length, curly, blue and grey hair. I'm white. I'm wearing a short-sleeve yellow shirt with the characters from The Wizard of Oz on it, with a black suspender skirt. And I'm wearing red lipstick and black eyeliner. The exhibition was only one part of the Beyond the Binary project. The project itself was looking at kind of queering and questioning the museum's collections. And what I mean by that is we started off by really looking into what the Pitt Rivers already had and how we could tell LGBTQIA+ stories from those. Not necessarily using those terms because those are very Western terms, but it was helpful for us in terms of framing the exhibition. And so we also have interventions. So there's a trail you can do around the main galleries following these 12 interventions, some of which are done by community curators, some are done by artists, Indigenous artists, for example, activists, some are done by myself. And it really kind of picks out different objects in the main galleries that we really want to make a statement about, either in terms of LGBTQ+ histories, or also in terms of decolonizing histories, which have a lot to do with kind of gender presentation in some of the communities that are displayed in the Pitt Rivers. So for example, in the Pacific Islands and New Zealand, there were different gender identities that were criminalized by the British, for example. So things like that we're really kind of looking at because, as you may know, the Pitt Rivers has quite a problematic history in terms of colonization, in terms of acquiring objects from different parts of the world. So we really needed to address that while we're looking at LGBTQ+ histories, because they really cannot be separated when you're doing this kind of work. It's really important to look at them in tandem. So one key aspect of the Beyond the Binary project is to also look at decolonizing and looking at decolonizing and queering as hand in hand. You can't really separate them on a project like this in a museum like the Pitt Rivers, largely because a lot of the British and other European colonists actually made certain gender and identities and sexualities illegal. Identities that were, completely normal for those areas beforehand. And they, tried to eradicate them, partly for religious reasons, but partly because, it gave them power to kind of criminalize identities that were normal as part of those cultures. So when you actually come to the Beyond the Binary exhibition, you're faced with that kind of problematic colonial history as you actually come through those main galleries in order to get to the temporary exhibition space. So you really kind of get this idea of what the Pitt Rivers has been doing in the past, and what we're trying to do today in terms of decolonizing the actual museum and seeing kind of new objects or objects framed in a different way. So one of the most important parts of the exhibition, or the way that the exhibition was curated, was working with both community curators from the local community, as well as international Indigenous artists and activists who were able to make their own responses to objects already in the museum, as well as contribute new material. And so the community curators, as I said, were more local. They were able to respond in a huge variety of ways to the objects the Pitt Rivers have, and again, some of them contributed new material. So we've got poems, we've got beadwork, we've got more traditional kind of academic responses, and community curators kind of curated everything from whole sections to just individual objects. So they were really able to choose how they got involved. In terms of working with Indigenous artists and activists, it was really, really important for us to kind of get their responses to the objects, particularly because a lot of these objects had been taken violently from their communities historically. So it was really important that we kind of get their words in the museum today. So as you may be aware, the exhibition is titled Beyond the Binary, Gender, Sexuality and Power. So I'm going to talk a bit about the power aspect of the exhibition. In terms of power, part of it we're talking about kind of activism and that kind of power, but we're also talking about faith, spirituality and witchcraft, my favorite. One of the most famous objects in the Pitt Rivers itself is the witch in the bottle. And I am here holding the handling version of the object. just so that I can describe what it feels like a little bit more. So I'll describe how it looks first, and then we'll talk a bit more about the context and some other objects that relate to it. So the witch in the bottle is approximately 11 centimeters high. It's made of glass. It has a sort of silver finish to it. It's pear-shaped, so it's wider at the bottom, and then there's a little sort of bump towards the neck of the bottle, and then the top. It's got red wax seal on it, and it has these ridges that run vertically down the bottle, so when you sort of run your finger along it, you can sort of feel these quite nice smooth ridges going right round the bottle. So the bottle, it was collected by the museum in 1926, but it was actually collected by its original owner in 1915 in Sussex. And the bottle was collected by Margaret Murray, a folklorist and archaeologist. She was originally actually an Egyptologist, but during the First World War, when she couldn't work as an archaeologist, she got really interested in British folklore, and that's when she started developing what she called her witch cult theory. So one interesting thing about this particular witch in the bottle is that it supposedly contained the ghost of a male witch. Now in England, most of the people persecuted for witchcraft were female, and part of that was, to do with kind of gender non-conformity and sexuality. But we do there are, a few cases where we hear about kind of male witches. So I thought it was pretty interesting in terms of gender, because the stories of male witches that we do know, again, a lot of them were gender non-conforming and gay. So this could have been referring to a kind of LGBTQIA plus witch in some way, or a non-conforming witch at least. So I think that's really interesting in terms of LGBTQ plus histories. But also, the wider history of the persecution of witches is really, really interesting in terms of the LGBTQIA plus community. One, as I said, because a lot of the LGBTQ plus community were persecuted as witches, it was an easy way for them to kind of persecute things like gender presentation and sexuality, particularly when there weren't laws around them. So there weren't necessarily laws around women having sex with each other. There were for men, but not for women. So it was kind of an easy way to grab them, accuse them of being witches. But also, in a more positive light, although there's this kind of history of oppression, in a more positive light, the LGBTQIA plus community has actually they're sort of drawn to witchcraft and drawn to sort of esoteric things, the occult, astrology, all that sort of thing. And I think in a way, it's kind of reclaiming that oppression in one way. And another way, it's kind of finding power from it. But also it does there were these kind of long connections. Even though a lot of the accusations were false, there are long histories of queer people in the past engaging in these practices. So it's not completely false, but we do have to sort of look at things with a cynical eye, I guess. So the bottle is also interesting in terms of its collection history. As I mentioned, Margaret Murray was the archaeologist and folklorist who collected this object. And she, in 1921, published a book called The Witch Cult of Western Europe. Now, this book became actually quite popular, both academically and culturally. For example, the lesbian author Sylvia Townsend Warner in 1926 published the book Lolly Willows, kind of about a satanic lesbian, really. It was satire, but that was very much based on Margaret Murray's witch cult work. And so other people also were influenced by this work. So, for example, Vita Sackville-West, another author, she was really interested in the work that Margaret Murray was doing about Joan of Arc. So one of the main features in this witch cult book was a section on Joan of Arc, and really basically, instead of saying that Joan of Arc was, a Christian saint, that she martyred herself for her Christian beliefs, that actually she was a witch, and she martyred herself for her occult beliefs. And so she really got into this idea. She got into what she thought these witches were doing. It was very much kind of based on ancient deities, worshipping ancient deities and that sort of thing. And she developed this whole idea, and she was convinced that people were still practicing witchcraft in this way. And then again, later in the 70s, her ideas were picked up again by gay activists particularly. One quite well-known book is Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture by Arthur Evans, which is pretty much based all on Margaret Murray's witch cult work. Again, Arthur Evans brings up Joan of Arc, but instead of kind of talking about Joan of Arc in terms of kind of sacrificing herself for being a witch, it's talking about Joan of Arc of sacrificing herself for being queer, for being a lesbian and possibly trans or a cross-dresser. And when I'm referring to Joan of Arc here, I'm using she pronouns because Margaret Murray and Arthur Evans used them. But Joan of Arc could have a variety of different pronouns, so that's why we kind of chose not to give Joan any pronouns in the exhibition. So another history of gender that's very much related to witchcraft and very much related to sexuality in the LGBTQIA+ community is the idea of the wandering womb and hysteria. So you may be familiar with this kind of 19th century idea of hysteria. I think there's been some films about it, whereby they kind of considered that women's issues or people born with a uterus, that their issues were all based on something being wrong with this uterus. And the fact, it dates back to ancient ideas, whereby the uterus, they called it the wandering womb, and it would sort of apparently would wander around the body when there were issues going on, and they had to sort of draw it back into the right place in order for the woman or the person with the uterus to be happy and healthy again. That it shows really how ignorant they were about women's bodies, or about uterus and ovaries and all this kind of thing. So ancient Greek and Roman doctors believed that if you put something nice smelling up your nose and something horrible smelling up your vagina, or the other way around, it would draw your uterus back into the right place. But really, the ultimate cure, they believed, was getting married and having a baby, of course. Otherwise, you would go mad and throw yourself down a well. So these ideas, they were still going right up into the 19th century. And they tied in, they really inspired these ideas about hysteria that doctors were sort of developing at that time. Again, kind of relating women's issues back to their, uteri. And different techniques were developed to cure hysteria. Again, it was all very much about getting married and having babies, but if you couldn't do that, doctors would actually masturbate the patient themselves and, actually probably sexually violating many of their patients. And this is why vibrators were invented as an easy way for doctors to make hysteria patients orgasm. It's completely ridiculous. We know that is totally false. But it's really interesting to see how these kind of ideas about gender lasted for hundreds, thousands of years, essentially, without changing. So I have we have a replica of one of the objects that we have in the Objects of Power section, which is an ex voto ceramic figurine of a uterus and bladder. It's Roman. It's made of terracotta. It is 15 centimeters long, 10 centimeters wide, and it's kind of the shape of a small football, if you can imagine that. It has curvy horizontal ridges on it that you can sort of run your finger down. They're quite deep and sort of feel those. And it is made of terracotta, so it's a sort of, terracotta color. These ex voto figurines, they were, or votive, if you like, in plain English, were left as offerings for various gods and goddesses of healing, for example, Asclepius. And they were often left by women who who thought that their womb was wandering, because that's what doctors said. So they'd often leave these kind of offerings to help them heal, and also to help them, get married and have babies, because of course that is what you should do. So in the exhibition itself, we have a small amulet of Joan of Arc, which was collected by the museum in 1901. And when I say small, it is very small. It is 4 centimeters high and 1.4 centimeters wide. It is made of a silver metal, and it shows Joan of Arc in sort of full battle gear, with Joan holding a weapon. And so in the exhibition itself, we haven't given Joan a pronoun because Joan has really become a symbol for so many different identities and groups, from lesbian, trans, asexual, schizophrenic even. Joan is a hero for so many, so we thought it would be kind of more respectful not to give Joan a pronoun in the exhibition. So Joan is very much related to, well, histories of gender, histories of sexuality, and of course, histories of witchcraft, and the witch in the bottle, which we've also looked at. As I said, Margaret Murray wrote about Joan of Arc in her witch cult theory of Western Europe. Arthur Evans wrote about Joan of Arc in the witchcraft and the gay counterculture. And in 1936, Vita Sackville-West, the queer author, writer, and one-time lover of Virginia Woolf, actually wrote a book about Joan of Arc, taking quite a lot of inspiration from Margaret Murray's work. And in her book, she really frames Joan of Arc as a lesbian, as having sexual relations with other women, and looking at Joan as kind of more cross-dressing, or Joan as more kind of dressing in a butch fashion, rather than actually being trans. And again, this book became very popular. It was obviously later refuted academically because we don't know the truth about Joan. And I think that's the really interesting thing, is that, since we don't know the truth, Joan can be a symbol of power for so many. Something I was really interested in doing as a researcher was connecting objects that the Pitt Rivers Museum already had to contemporary LGBTQIA+ culture, whether that be activism or whether that be things like TV shows. And so I had to include one of my favorites, which was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but in particular, the lesbian witch couple, Tara and Willow, who were the first long-term lesbian couple on mainstream TV, which is a really important point. This is kind of in the late 90s, early 2000s. And growing up, they were such a huge inspiration to me, and it was so nice to sort of see myself represented as I was growing up and discovering my own identity. And so, of course, they also connect to these stories of the LGBTQ community, particularly the lesbian and bisexual community, witchcraft. It was really nice to see myself represented on TV, and it was really nice to see these kind of histories of witchcraft being connected to the LGBTQIA+ community in the media.